All right, well, welcome everybody to broadcasting from the home office in the home I grew up in, Albany, New York, but beaming straight to your respective computers in Toronto, Ontario. We have an opportunity to do a little bit of a deep dive tonight, looking at the first verse of Parshas Kedoshim. So we have a double Parsha this week, Acharei Kadoshim, which Acharei focuses on it begins by framing itself as being after the tragedy of the death of Nadav and Avihu, which we studied a few weeks ago during Shmini, um, and then but then switches into a bunch of regulations about how to maintain holiness in interpersonal matters, how to maintain, let's say, an ethical relationship within your family and things like that. So these are often commonly read on the afternoon on Yom Kippur. But then we move into Kadoshim, which begins with this clarion call that God says, Kadoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy. And what I find so interesting and so evocative about this pasuk is that it is not clear to me what holiness means. Right? Holiness seems to be a central concept that distinguishes religion from other systems of meaning. Right? Like you don't say philosophy's central focus is not holiness. Right? Ethics' central focus is not holiness. Religion's central focus seems to be the sacred. So what is it to be holy? What does it mean to have holiness? What is it to be sacred? So that's what I want to explore in today's class, and it is a question that the Meforshim, that the commentators also take up as well. Before we dive into the sources, I am curious what you associate holiness to mean. Do you have any, what comes to mind when you think of holiness, of Kedusha?
Living according to halacha,
Okay.
and including the ethics, including even more important human to human than human to Hashem.
Okay. So there's following the Jewish law, and then also it seems to be combining that with a sense of morality. Okay. Yeah, Marta?
I was going to say that in some ways, holiness seems to be perceived as like the absence of evil. So,
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who is holy does not commit like, murder and whatnot, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so a little bit more of an accessible standard of holiness, right? Not doing the bad.
Slightly.
Right. So I mean, that's like commonly you see that pasuk that we say in the book of Psalms, that we say pasuk de Zimra on Shabbos. We say sur meirav aseh tov, right? Hold off from doing evil and do good. And like every Mussernik says, first you refrain from doing evil, and then that clears the space for you to do good. Beautiful. All right. Any other ideas? What do you associate kedusha with? What does it mean to be kadosh?
I don't
Why
know.
is it that? What do we do when we say Kaddish on Shabbos? Right? Yeah, shush.
For me, I was gonna say like unattainable unless you're like
Mm-hmm.
not in this world. Not
Okay.
attainable in this world.
Okay. So it's like asymptotic, right? You can like approach it, but you never quite get there.
Mm-hmm.
And also something else you're bringing in is something transcendental, right? That it seems like kedusha is some kind of heavenly, angelic, divine quality, something that's not just like, let's say, morality, right? That's a human quality. It's the pinnacle of what it means to develop as a human being. But kedusha, maybe that's like another level. That's another dimension that we're bringing to what it means to be alive, what it means to be active. Okay, great. And I think everyone is touching on something good, right? I think it would be incoherent to have a notion of kedusha that could tolerate evil. I think it would be. I think I hear what in terms of what Marta was saying, in terms of what Lauren was saying. It's very much the case that kedusha seems to be the telos, it's the goal of following halacha, and also that there's not just following the rules, but there's an extra sense of doing the right and the good, right? So it's not just doing what's expected of you, but it's also doing something a bit more than that. So that's that notion of what supererogatory element, right? That like a little bit more, that lifnin mishurat hadin, or something that's just not just the bottom line, but something that's the right thing, right? Better, more than what you have to do, it's what you should do. Right? So holiness seems to be something super erogatory, something that says a little bit more. And that's precisely what I want to explore, because Kedusha is like problem for the rabbis. Now, again, by now we know that problem isn't a bad thing. Problem means it's something that needs to be addressed. Like, what does it mean to be holy? That's not just mutter. So I'm going to push a little back, right, on the legal definition. We know what it means to follow halacha. That's mutter, right? You're doing what's permitted. But what does it mean to be holy? Something else. So we're going to explore that productive disjuncture now. So I'm going to share screen, and we're going to dive into too many sources as we read. All right, can everyone see that okay?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So let's start with the pasuk. So it says, I'm going to show you more. Daber el kol adat b'nei Yisrael v'amarta alehem Kedoshim tiyu. So speak to the entire community of the children of Israel and say to them, be holy. Ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokeichem. Because I, the Lord your God, am holy. So what are the major elements that stand out in this pasuk? What's worthy of paying attention to? What do you think the rabbis are going to focus on? It's one classic element, right? That doesn't. I mean, one of these things start like thinking like a maforish, start thinking like a rabbi, right? What doesn't have to be there but is there? Why is it that God asks Moses to frame this in the view of the entire community of Israel? Right? Why isn't this just for the Kohanim? Right? Vayikra is all about the Kohanim. Why is this directed to the entire people? So that's one question, right? It says be holy, doesn't define it, but it also pins on because I am holy, God. So it seems like, per what Shosh was saying before, that there's something divine about what it means to be holy. And what it means to attain this holiness seems to be to do some kind of imitatio Dei, right? To imitate, to model yourself after God. So we're going to look at all these elements, right? All these elements stick out. They're bolate, right? And they stick out. They grab our attention. So we're going to look at what the Meforshim have to say. So Rashi notices that this pasuk is directed to the entire community of Israel, and he says, so one of the duties of the king, as defined in Deuteronomy 17, is that once a year around Sukkot, they have to gather the entire community of Israel and teach them Torah. So this is, and that's called hakel. So this is a similar issue here, is that this is a hakel. You're bringing together the entire community for instruction because it's all relevant for them in some way. Holiness is not just for the religious professionals. It's not just for the rabbis. It's not just for the priests. Holiness, on one hand, is something that's godly, but on the other hand, is accessible potentially to everybody. So it's the highest, right, in terms of like bringing down the heavenly element into this world. But it's the lowest, I don't know if lowest is the right word, but it's the most accessible in the sense that it is a standard that everyone is invited to approach, is to try to strive after. So mipnei sherov gufei haTorah tuluyin ba. Says the notion of kol adas, right? Why is it every single people of Israel? Because most of the Torah's substance, the guf haTorah, the body of the Torah, most of the Torah's substance is dependent on it. Whoa. So holiness is not just some abstruse concept. It's, according to this Sifra, this Tannaitic Midrash that Rashi is quoting, a core concept for Torah. You can't have Torah without Kedusha. It's its operating central principle, it seems, right? That the Torah, for Torah to be executed, for Torah to be actualized, for Torah to be activated, it needs to be in light of Kedusha, in light of holiness, to achieve holiness. Okay, look at another Rashi. Rashi, he's an important guy. He says, so here he addresses the central command. He says, Kadoshim tiyu, be holy. And here we have a famous Rashi. We're going to get into the famous debate between Rashi and Ramban, Nachmanides. So Rashi says, the word kadosh refers to being parush, specifically Perushi min ha'arayos umin ha'avera. Okay? So what's important to note here is that right before, remember I was saying that Acharei mos Kedoshim, right? Right before Kadoshim is a lot of laws about sexual morality, right? Morality in your home life, morality in your domestic sphere, right? Laws about incest specifically and other crimes like that. So Rashi says, aha, right? This is the way rabbis think. Things are next to each other for a reason in the Torah, right? They bump up against each other for reasons. What's called a hekesh. So since they're flowing into each other, aha, so Kedoshim to you seems to be directed specifically towards your appetite, right? Not just your appetite, but specifically when it has to do with your continence, what the medieval Catholics would call your continence, right? Your sexual morality specifically. The word parush, idiomatically speaking, means ascetic, right? Somebody who is refraining from things, usually especially sexual things. So you're refraining from arayos, from sexual immorality, and from avera, from sin in general. But he's focusing on the arayos. Now, what's interesting also about the word kadosh, like the word mikudash or the word hekdesh, is that the word kadosh doesn't, before it means holiness, right? I feel you have to remember, holiness is an English word. We should actually forget the word holiness. It means nothing. What does kadosh mean? So when something is hekdesh, or when it's mekudesh, what does that mean? It means it's been dedicated. Dedicated to the temple, right? Because it's to the mikdash, right? To the temple. So you've made it, you've sanctified it, or you've distinguished it. You said, aha, this is for God. So Rashi takes that and says, Kadosh means a sense of separateness. Parush means to be separate from something. It means to be refraining, withholding from something. So separate, the notion that the people of Israel are holy, this is a different verse, he makes this comment, but the fact that the people of Israel are deemed holy, he says, because they are set aside. They are separate. They're special in that kind of way. And similarly, interestingly, here, holiness has to do with how you set yourself aside from these specific things. And specifically when it comes to arayos, right, it comes from these potential of incest. What is that? Those are two things that are close together, family members, which should not be mixing. Right, so we have a closeness, but what is required to navigate that is separation. So holiness, according to Rashi, is a dynamic of separation, right, with restraint, withholding, and separation. So it is maybe whose model, when we were chatting about this before, would it map to? I would say Marta, right, was intuiting Rashi's point. Holiness to Rashi is refraining from these wicked things, right? So it seems like it's clearing out that space, right? Not entering the space of these kinds of these things that you don't have license to do, and especially when it comes to sexuality, sexuality as a zone, right, in human interaction, which has everything. It's not. I think it's not just keeping away from sin. But there's something about the holiness, the potential holiness of an ethical sexual relationship, right? Which is being implied here, right? That sexuality is something in human beings that is able to, right? The way that people come together, the way that they help create new life, if that is in the way that they can do that, right? That's actually, there's a book actually by a man named Charles Mopsik of blessed memory. He was a French scholar of Kabbalah, and he wrote a book called Sex of the Soul. In which he's saying actually that reproduction in his account of it is in some ways like the human divine element. So here we have this notion of sexuality between people as an opportunity for holiness, and that has to be done right by making sure it is done in an ethical, restrained, and mature fashion. Okay, so that's a Rashi. Rashi says Kedusha has to do with your sexual continence specifically. And here to back that up, right, we have this notion that here's the Sifra that we mentioned before, that this Parshah was set in front of the whole Kahal. This is something for everybody, and that I think reinforces Rashi's point right? That sexuality is an aspect of human life, which is, like we don't have an asceticism-based religion, right? We have a religion where it's not like we refrain from sexuality writ large, but no, we find a way to actually perform it, to enact it in ethical, moral, and mature, respectable, consensual ways. Right? So we find a way to sanctify how we act in the world, rather than, I guess, like the messiness of what human interaction entails, going, oh, it's a trap. No, you find ways to navigate it. You find ways to sanctify these interpersonal relationships. We don't refrain from them. We refrain from what it means to hurt other people through them. We find ways, though, to sanctify them in ways that we come together ethically. So, okay. And here we have this notion of, ella im makdishim atem oti hareini mekudash v'im lav eini mekudash. This is a beautiful point he makes here, that the Sifra makes here. He says, Ki Kadosh ani Hashem Elokeichem. For I, the Lord your God, am holy. All right, so the Midrash says back about this. It says, Lomar, this is saying, im makdishim, or mekadshim, atem atzmechem, ma'ale ani aleichem ki ilu kidashtem oti. Beautiful point. He says, God says, in the Midrash's imagination, that if you sanctify yourselves, people of Israel, then I will consider it as if you have sanctified me. That's an amazing point. That's like who would have, that really comes out of left field. God, we would figure, is holy already. Ki Kadosh ani Hashem Elokeichem. I am holy. You be holy because I am already holy. But no, you be holy. The word, and this is a grammar point. I know, where's all my grammar nerds? The word ki can mean because, but it can also mean such that in biblical Hebrew. So, be holy so that I am holy, says God. So by us sanctifying ourselves, by us acting in holy ways, in this interpersonal way like Rashi is describing, or in other ways as we'll see later, God is saying, by you making yourselves holy in this world, it's not just on this plane, it actually even has an impact on me. You sanctify me too. And it leaves open, again, because it leaves this word Kadosh as this like open field. It's still not clear what it's getting at exactly. What does it mean to sanctify God? I mean, here I guess we have the notion of a Kiddush Hashem, right? This idea of acting in a way that proves God worthy, acting in a way that is worthy of God, right? So in the most intense version of that, Kiddush Hashem has come to mean like is the language you use in Judaism for martyrdom, by dying al Kiddush Hashem, right? Someone tries to coerce you into giving up your religion, dying for the sake of God. But, in a less morbid fashion, being Mekadosh Hashem can also mean, and I think unfortunately we're seeing a lot of opposite examples of this in the news, but ways of behaving in a world that rubs off well on on what it means to be a Jew, on what it means to be a servant of God, right? Like, oh, a Jew acts like that. Of course they do, because they're a believer, right? The way that we are God's representatives on this earth, that we are in some way bearing that responsibility. I think we've seen a number of examples of Jews in the news who I think have unfortunately lapsed into a kind of chauvinism, right? Have lapsed in a certain kind of forgetting that we're supposed to be. I mean, the lowest level of that is that people are watching. The higher level of it is that what it means to be a Jew is to have a vocation. That vocation is Kedusha. What does it mean to be a Jew? Kadoshim to you. Be holy. The whole Torah is hanging on us being holy. We've lost the holiness element, and that's why I wanted to teach this class. What it means to be a Jew isn't just the bottom line letter law, right? Like Lauren was saying before. It's not just keeping halacha. Or if we keep halacha and we don't have the spirit of the law, it becomes a parody of itself. It becomes nothing. It becomes something that's just technicalities and loopholes and nonsense. Torah has to be alive for it to mean something. Kedusha is what is the spirit that infuses the letter of the law. By us making ourselves holy, we even have an impact, kivyochel, on God. And if the opposite, if you don't sanctify yourselves, then I'm going to consider you as if you didn't sanctify me. Very bad. Oh, eino omer ela im makdishim atem oti, hareini mekudash. Im lav eini mekudash. You can even say that. If you act in this holy way, I am sanctified, says God. If not, I'm not. Talmud Lomar, ki kadosh ani, b'kedushati ani, bein makdishim oti uvein ein makdishim oti. So here we have the Midrash walking it back. He says, okay, I'm not going to quite go so far as to say, if you sanctify me, I'm holy, and if you don't, I'm not holy, because it's my holiness. You're drawing on my holiness. It's a cycle, right? It's like the water cycle. It's like the Krebs cycle, but it's the holiness cycle, right? God is the source. It's the makor chayim. It's the source of life. We draw down God's spirit into us to sanctify us, and we beam it back up when we do that. And if we don't, we're just straining God's holiness energy. But God, of course, is not exhausted. It says, Abba Shaul Omer Pamalia Lamelech, Umaleh Lios Mechaken Lamelech. It means we're in the retinue of the king. We're in the posse of the king. That's what it means to be Kadosh. It's like we're angels. Not in the sense that we're not humans, but the word malach means messenger. We're God's messengers, right? We're God's agents. We're God's representatives. We're the person that you send to go sign the contract because you can't go yourself, right? We have the contract in our hands. It's the Torah. And we are bearing God's sigil. We're bearing God's standard in this world. That's what it means. Okay. So this is a famous machlokes between Rashi and Ramban. Rashi has a particular reading of Kadosh. He says that's to do with sexual continence, sexual holiness. And he gestures towards, and from sin in general. But Ramban, so it's a particular reading. But Ramban, a 13th century Spanish mystic and commentator, says, no. So here he quotes Rashi. He always starts by quoting Rashi. He's like, I'm gonna poke you. So he says, okay, he quotes the Rashi. He says, fine. He said, but I saw in the Torah's Kohanim, which is another name for Sifra, for the Midrash on Vayikra, he says, Ra'isi stam perushim to you. We've already seen the phrase perushim to you. You should be separate. You should be ascetic. You should be sexually continent. Fine. V'chein shanu sham, right? And we have in Shemini, earlier, a few parshios earlier in Torah, it says, V'his kadishtem hayisim kadoshim, right? Make yourselves holy, right? It's the reflexive verb here. And you will be holy. Ki kadoshini, because I am holy, says God. Kishem sh'ani kadosh, kach atem tiyu kadoshim. Just like I am holy, you will be holy. Kishem sh'ani parush, kach atem tiyu parushim. Just like I, God, am mindful of interpersonal relationships and those kinds of things. I am continent. So you should also be mindful of these things. Fine. The point he's making here, as a good exegete, is we already saw Perushim Tihiyu on the previous verse. Think like a rabbi. If we saw it in the previous verse, then why does it mean it here? It's inefficient. The Torah is not inefficient. The Torah is chock full of stuff. You can't ever be just saying, it's like the thing before. Something in the Torah is something, right? It's always doing something new. So if we already covered Perushim Tihiyu, right, sexual morality as holiness, in V'his Kadishtem Vayisim Kadoshim, then what's it doing here? There has to be something else going on. So he says, Perishus, it's already been covered. Rather, skip. Here we go. He says. So he's saying, Ki Torah he's here about arayos. Right? The Torah has warned us about sexual sin. And ma'achole masurim. Veitira habia ish beishto. Right? So the Torah has warned us about immoral sin, right? Sinful sex. And it's also warned us about forbidden food, right? All kinds of human appetite things, right? We know in all kind of anthropological literature, food, sex comes together. Besides like wanting like chocolate chip strawberries, besides that. It says, V'hitira habia, but the Torah has permitted us to have moral, consensual sex, right? Ish be'ishto, with one spouse and another. V'achilas habasar v'hayayin, and the Torah has forbidden us from eating treif, but it's allowed us to have meat and wine. Now, why is it that these are examples of what that he says the Torah permits us to do? What zone are we in now? And this is the zone that he thinks Kedusha operates in. It's a very famous Ramban, and it's a really amazing point he makes. So what zone are we in?
Human as opposed to angels.
Okay, good. So first of all, right, it's not that, angels don't get married. Angels don't have partners, right? Angels don't eat food. Maybe whatever. I guess maybe they have to when they come down and they visit Abraham or whatever. But like angels don't eat, right? Angels don't have appetites. So the Torah does allow us to do these things. So we don't have an essentially ascetic religion, right? We're not priests of the Catholic variety. We don't take vows of poverty. Okay, so we're in a human realm. Good point, Lauren. But now that we're in the human realm, where does that land us in a sense? What do we have to learn how to do? Or what's still possible? You can't eat pork. You can't have a cheeseburger. You can't have inappropriate relations with a family member. But what can you do? You can have a hamburger. You can drink a bottle of wine, right? You can have an Impossible burger with a real slice of cheese. So, but what zone are we in now? We're in the zone of the permitted. And also then the zone of the potential for abuse, the potential for overindulgence. Just because we're doing things permitted doesn't mean we're doing things well. This is the zone that he thinks Kedusha operates in. This is the difference between someone who fresses, right? Just like chows down on food, just lets their appetite take them over, and someone who is learning how to navigate the world with moderation. So he says, if so, you'd see Yimsa Bal Hataiva Makom Lihios Shatuf Bezemes Ishto, O Nasha of Harabos. I would see somebody actually who thinks then that they're permitted to engage in inappropriate sexual acts, or to, in like a polygamous time, or to load up on wives, right? Just a whole van full of wives, right? The point is just letting one's appetite or letting one's what one is aiming for just take them over. But he says here, or to be lihios besob yayin bezule basar, right? Or instead, maybe actually to be just a drunkard, right? Just gluttonous in their consumption of wine, or gluttonous and they're just like eating fatty meats, right? And loading up on cholesterol, letting their appetite take them over. So he says, he says, it's God's will that I can have whatever was not forbidden. Whatever was not forbidden. All these nevelos, right? All these things that really aren't fit for consumption. But God didn't forbid them for me. So they're all mine. I can have whatever I want. I can have a zillion hamburgers. My arteries be damned. Who cares? Right? This is not acting. He says, what do you end up being? I love this phrase. You're a novel, Birshus HaTorah. You're a villain within the boundaries of the Torah. Amazing. And it's a really important point he's making, right? If you see Torah as rules you need to follow, then, and not as a set of values you need to embody, you end up becoming a parody. You end up becoming something empty. So Ramban sees holiness as something that is inherently beyond the bounds of mutter and usser, right? Beyond the bounds of what's just permitted and forbidden. I want to say beyond good and evil, but that's not quite right. But it's beyond mutter and usser, right? It's not just what you're allowed and what you're not allowed. Even within what you're allowed to do, the question is this wise? Is it good? Is it mature? Is it moderate? Is it well thought through? Are you modeling yourself well? Are you being a good example? Is it holy? Right? This is the question of something that's just above the bottom line. So this is that supererogatory element that we brought in before. And Ramban really sees this as the key to what it means to not just be following halacha, but what it means to be a good Jew. This is something I'm very passionate about personally, and something that I really, listen, I'm not that I can say I live up to the standard all the time, but I mean rather that it has to mean something to be a Jew. It has to mean something to keep the Torah. It has to mean something to be an Eved Hashem. It can't just be the only way to understand it is that you just need to know the halacha, right? I think unfortunately that's a trend that we're seeing more and more. It's just, okay, whatever the Torah says I can do, or what I can't do, and that's what it means. That's all it means. But Ramban is saying, no. How you behave in this world, that matters. It's not just what you do. It's how you do it. It's how you live. It's not just the choices that you make, but it's how you navigate those choices. Okay. Thoughts? How do we? It's a very big idea he's saying here. But how do you take it? What's some reflections? Yeah, Lauren.
Sorry, that's Torah B'derech Eretz, which we learned as B'nai Akiva Nix. Right? That's Torah and Derech Eretz.
Very much.
Without it, you've lost the way. Like you say, it's just empty laws, and you're forgetting about the meaning, the spirit, and how to be a mensch.
Yes, although I want to radicalize that a little bit and say it's not just Torah v'derech eretz. It's that maybe we can synthesize Rashi and Ramban, and we say that, like Rashi was saying, the gufei Torah tuluim ba. It's not just Torah and derech eretz. Is that kedusha is central to what Torah entails. That we have this idea of there's Torah and there's morality. And Ramban is saying he has a synthetic view. He's saying there is no Torah without holiness. So derech eretz is key to Torah here. So yeah, very much. Marta?
I was just kind of wondering, going back to the point of the topic of overindulgence, for example. So let's say I enjoy drinking wine, okay? And is it up to me to decide how much wine is too much? Who's kind of the judgment on okay, this amount of wine is holy enough, this amount of wine is no longer holy, you should really cut what you're drinking.
Right, that's a great point. So above he gets in the point of so he's drawing on Rambam, right? So this is Nachman, he's drawing on Maimonides, which is the notion of Shvil Hazav, the golden mean, the idea of living moderately, right? But it's not what you're in is an interesting zone, right? Because when it comes to halacha, it's based on shiurim, right? It's based in measurements. Okay, you need to have a quarter log of wine. You need to have a kazayis of bread, right? You have you have a kabetza of matzah, right? To be a real stark yid. But when it comes to not doing things, or what it means to then re-permit yourself to do, what it means to dabble in these things responsibly or in a holy or sanctified fashion, that's a very good question, right? We can't, in a sense, just have law because it seems like exactly what you're saying, Marta. It's individualized, right? It's each person trying to figure. So I think with a lot of these things, we find that the Torah actually has a lot of room for individuation, because the Torah needs to be enacted and actualized by people. And to do it well, to do it meaningfully, it means you need to know what your own interior landscape is. Right? You need to know what it means to do that. But I think actually you're intuiting a text I wanted to bring in later, but you know what? Zoom. Let's zoom. Yeah, here we go. So here's the Amek Davar, who's one of my favorite Meforshim, the Netziv, Naftali Tzvi Berlin, is a student of the Volozhiner Rebbe. He writes, Kadoshim to you, V'ikdim akasukan, right? And the Torah makes sure to front this notion of El Kol Adas B'nai Israel. So before we saw a more holistic vision of that, like Rashi drawing in the Torah's Kohanim, right? Because everyone needs to know about this. This is relevant for everybody because the Torah is dependent on it. But he has a different notion of Kol. He has a different notion of everyone. Why is it everyone, he says? Because Ba'asher ein perishas kol adam shaveh. Because each person's navigation of this, right, withholding or refraining, or what it means to navigate this in this kind of mature way, not everyone's is equal. Ein perishas kol adam shaveh. V'toras kol achad levado biyado. What a phrase! From a real Litvisher Rebbe, he says, and the Torah of every individual is in their hand. Everyone is grasping their own Torah. Everyone's holding their own, everyone has their own Torah, like the Torah of their individuality. So it can't be written in the Shulchan Aruch, because it's the Torah you have in yourself. So you need to learn the Torah of yourself to know what it means to do this. No one outside can, you can have like trusted advisors, you can talk to your teacher, you can talk to your parents, you can talk to role models, talk to your friends, your chavrusas, right? You can talk to people about like, what does it mean to do this? Like, what does it mean to engage in this? What does it mean to be holy? Those are important questions. Dialogue is a really important way to get to know yourself. But it's a Torah that's in your hand. It's up to you. Not something you're like accustomed to hearing when it comes to Judaism. But again, this is the tavlin, right? This is the spice. This is like what flavors the entire point of what it means to live as a Jew, is it has to be meaningful, that you are acting meaningfully in this world. That the choices you're making are meaningful ones. And you're navigating the landscape of yourself. Right? Every person's Torah is in their hands. Lefi teva gufo v'halichos beso chidome. And what's the Torah? What does it reflect? It reflects your nature. It reflects the way you were raised. It reflects your physicality. Maybe your genetics, right? The Torah of nurture, the Torah of nature. Whatever it is that went into making you, that's a Torah too, and that's what's informing these choices. It is a freedom, right? It's the freedom, though, of responsibility. And I find that especially meaningful. That we're free. There's like this room for like the free Judaism, right? Because it's the Judaism of the choices that you make. It's the Torah of your choices. That's what Ramban is getting at. And as the Ha'amak Davar is saying, and there's no one else who can teach you that Torah in a sense. He gave it generally to the whole people of Israel. Be holy. But then we filter it into ourselves and we have to figure out what it means for each individual. Okay. So I want to look at this from the Or HaChaim. So this is 18th century Moroccan rabbi, Chaim ibn Attar, of whom it said that if he and the Baal Shem Tov ever met, Mashiach would come. Unfortunately, they never met, I think. So he says, Asher al kain ba maimer Hashem kan v'tziva b'ne'imus. He says, the word of God came and commanded us with ne'imus, with like a lovely tone, with temperance, with pleasantness. Imre Kadosh, the holy words, Kadoshim to you, be holy. And it's a beautiful phrase, right? Be holy, Kadoshim to you. Perush, shikadshu atzman b'ma'asim. What does it mean? That you're sanctifying yourself with your deeds. We are the things that we choose to do in this world. We're the book that we're writing of the choices that we make. We're known by what we do. Asher ba'aleim ha-mitzvah la'asosa. Right? And the mitzvah comes to do it. To act, to enact, to actualize. The thing is not coming in regards to your physical appetites, right? Or to complete some like aim, some objective that you have. That's not the point. Ela ya'aseh hadavar b'kedusha v'tahara. Acha. The principle of kedusha, right? You have to do these things in holiness, purity. Kedusha, says Chaim Ibn Attar, is a complete rejection of the ends justify the means. Because the end is only justified. The end, in a sense, is the result of the means, says Kedusha. For you to say, okay, I need to achieve this chayfetz, I need to figure out how to complete this thing in the world. That's the point. I need to do 5,000 mitzvahs. That's what I have to do. I have to do those mitzvahs. I have to get them done. But you forget that the point is how you do them. What kind of person that makes you. What kind of life that you're generating for yourself. Right? It's not just the what, it's the how. It's a very subtle way he's saying it. But the what is just the last part of the how. The path that we walk, the life that we lead, the choices that we make. You can, I think of it in a very small way and a very big way. You can think of it a small way in the sense of when you light Shabbos candles, are you going to give yourself the time and the space to think about what it means to do it? To pay attention to the way that your hand moves as the match alights on the wick. To pay attention to how you feel as you complete the act. To pay attention to the kavanas, the intention you're bringing into Shabbos as you begin its holiness. Right? Or are you just going to say, okay, I'm just going to get it done. Even that's a how, right? But the point is, is like the binary of yes, I did it, no, I didn't do it. The point is that it's a dimmer. Right? We're turning up the light. We're turning up the holiness in this world. How you do it is what turns it on. But we can think of it in a bigger way too, right? I think that's just really like bringing our attention to the way that we behave. You think of it as like a dancer, right? Every gradient of movement changes the piece entirely. Think about that when you're lighting the candle. But in a big way too, right? What he's saying is we can't think of Torah just as the results of doing the thing. We have to think of Torah of what it means to inform a life, to inform what goes into those achievements. Right? He uses examples like, okay, let's say you're wrapped in a tallis, or you wrap yourself in tefillin, right? And then, right, you're like, okay, I put on my tefillin, I did it. Put on the tallis, I did it. And then you just like have disgusting thoughts. So you have like nasty thoughts. You use your mind in a way that's unbecoming. There should be a disjuncture between those things. Otherwise, what does it mean to put on a tallis? What does it mean to put on tefillin if what you can do while you're wearing them is meaningless? If putting on tefillin doesn't impact the way that we think, the way that we feel, then haven't we, in a sense, undermined, evacuated the meaning of that tefillin brings? You say, fine, tefillin has its own inherent sanctity. God is holy without us. Fine, that's true. But how we use them in our lives, we have to be not just results-oriented, but also sensitive enough to feel what it is for it to do its work on us. Wearing tefillin should be changing the way that we feel, the way that we think. You want to live up to the standard of what it means to be wearing tzitzis, to be wearing tefillin, to be wearing a Star of David necklace, right? To be wearing a mezuzah necklace, to have a mezuzah in your home, right? These things should be changing our lives. To be holy is to be changed, transfigured, made better. Okay. I think there's a real push here against the notion that Judaism, in a sense, can't be explained. It can be explained because it needs to translate into terms that make sense to us as individuals and into, I think, universal human terms as well. So for us to say, oh, you don't get it, I'm wearing tzitzis, that's all that really matters. If you're wearing tzitzis, right, and again, it doesn't change the person you are, then you, kivyachol, I think, have changed tzitzis. right? You've tainted the tzitzis. The tzitzis needs to shape us. Tefillin needs to shape us. Right? We're wrapping ourselves in these things. We're surrounding ourselves with holiness. It needs to infuse our lives. Okay. So we saw the Hamikdavar before. I think we have time maybe for one of the Me'ashilachs. So here I'm going to actually get to the point that, again, like everything that everyone says, it's both beautiful, original points, and also you have your rabbis, because the Torah that you intuit is something that is very much what people have in their minds as well. So, per Shosh's point about the asymptotic holiness, right, something that we can strive for but never quite entirely embody, here we have, I think, actually a really empowering image. It says, Kadoshim to you, be holy. Interesting point, right? Because what tense is the word be in? You'd think it's in the command. It is in the command. It is an imperative. But it's framed in the future tense. So the notion of holiness as a futural act, right? Holiness is something that is in the future, something that you are approaching, something that is drawing you towards it. Not something that is just exhausted by the present, but something that is always the receding horizon. So he says, Kedusha Lashon Hazmana. Holiness is a language of invitation. And I wonder if here he means the future tense. Hainu Sheshem Yisbarach Mazhir Livnei Yisrael. God cautions, warns us. Sheyu Tamid Mekudashim. That we should always be holy. Always. Umizumanim, and invited, ready, right? The word mizuman is an interesting word. Zimun is the word we use when we say, Rabbi Sarmivon bench, right? Rabbi Taina Varech, let's bench, let's say the grace after meals. Let me invite you to say this with me. But it's like the word zimun or hazmana in Hebrew doesn't just mean to invite, it means like ready at hand. Actually, in German, it's Vorhandenkeit, right? It's at hand. Hazmana, it is ready to go. Right? That's what hazmana means. So that they should always be holy and ready. V'yitzapu tamid leYeshua Hashem Yisbarach. Always looking, peering, searching for ways to access God's salvation, God's redemption. Sheyoshia lahem v'ya'ir ne'em b'divrei Torah. That God will save us, God will redeem us, and will enlighten our eyes in the words of Torah. So what does it mean to be holy? It means to be on. It means to have your switch flipped on. It means to be active and alert. To know that holiness is not something that can be completed or satisfied or exhausted. Holiness is something to strive for. It is a horizon you're trying to grasp, but that there's always more to go. It is an asymptote you are approaching, but you never quite get there. Not in a way that disempowers us, in a way that empowers us. Holiness is infinite, so how could we ever exhaust it? It's to keep on feeding that engine, to keep on drawing down that shefa, to keep on striving for new ways to embody divinity, to embody holiness more. Ki kadosh ani, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. Be holy because I am holy, says God. Hainu sheshem yisbarach. Omer. Ki hu yisbarach mezuman tami lo shel Yisrael. It says, just like I say, please, you should be holy always. Always be looking for ways. Always be looking for ways to find me. God says similarly, I too am always ready, always invited, always at hand to save you. We are looking for ways to access God. And God says, just like you are doing that for me, I am doing that for you always. God is mezuman just like we are. V'al yidei zeh gam Yisrael tzrichim lios mezumanin latzapos tami laHashem shelo yatridu et asman b'iskei olam hazeh. Because of that, we need to have a better clarity of purpose. That we need to always be ready at hand to search always for God, and not to become distracted, distressed, troubled, deviated by, right, deferred by the matters of this world. Now, again, he's not saying become a hermit. He's not saying become some kind of anchorite monk. He is, though, saying Holiness is a view from eternity. It clarifies what's really important. Lahavdil elef havdalos. Really lahavdil. It's not the same, but there's an interesting conjunction. I think quarantine, I think the coronavirus experience has also given us a certain kind of viewpoint from eternity. Being closer at hand with vulnerability, with potential sickness, with seeing the way our lives are turned around, with seeing how many things get taken away. I think it's really helped to clarify what's important in our lives. It's helped get us away from, in some ways, the hustle and bustle of the day-to-day. And it's helped, I think, refocus many of us on our families, on matters of social justice, right? On a healthy and equitable society. It's helped, I think, clarify things. The viewpoint of eternity is what it means to live striving for holiness, says Mea Shilach. To not let the things that want to make a claim on your attention matter as much as they want you to think they matter, but to keep in mind what's really important, what it means to be bearing the standard of God in this world, to be doing goodness in this world, to be mindful of the ways that we impact others and impact our community, to be looking for ways to be representatives of the divine in the way that we behave. It's a tall order, and to his point, it's not one you can just get done, but it's essential, and it reframes and reprioritizes, rearranges the way that we view our participation in this world. So I'll just end with this point. In a different comment, Mea Shilach says, Kedoshim tiyu, kemoshe shamati, de Parshas Kedoshim, hapesicha Kedoshim tiyu, you shall be holy. Perush gam ken shu havtacha, it's a promise. She'az yihiyu Kadoshim, that then you will be holy in the future. It is an empowering future, not one of saying holiness is in the future so you should feel bad about the present, but rather holiness is in your future and I promise it's there for you. And that was true in the past as well, right? The present is the future of the past. Whoa. The point is, right, is that it's not like it's not a future that's never reached. It's a future that's always reached, but one that's never exhausted. There's always more to do, but also there's always more that we've done. So just as much for us to push ourselves and to challenge ourselves, to try to be holy, to embody the mitzvah of love your neighbor. He said, oh, this is incredible. He says, for example, the mitzvah to love your neighbor. She'ein biyada adam klal l'kayamo. No one can fully do that mitzvah. How could you ever say you've really ever loved anyone enough? Right? Love, like holiness, is also transcendent. We draw from it, but we can't complete it. He says, what if you're mad at somebody? What if you hate somebody? What if you can't get over this? What if you can't generate love for them? He says, Lo yo'ilu im kidem lahagia madregas kadosha. It's okay, because holiness is more. Holiness is always more. Love is always more. Be holy. Keep on trying. You can't ever do it all, but keep on trying. Don't think of yourself as having done enough or not done enough. Don't think of yourself as like, oh, I don't like psych yourself out of trying to do good in this world, but rather realize, like I think there's a through line here through all these parshas, Meforshim. There's a through line of it's not what you do in a sense, it's how you do. That there's always an opportunity to look at our lives, to take it up in our hands, the Torah that's in our hands, like the Hamek Dabar says, to look at our own individual Torah, to read it, to learn it, and to think hard about how I can be this best version of me, this holier version of me in this world, how I can tackle an inexhaustible resource, how I can drink from that reservoir, but also realize that there's more to always drink. It's an incredible challenge, but it's also an incredible promise that God makes to us. And I wish us all courage, I think, in doing that work, and encouragement. Look to the resources you have. Look to your friends. Look to conversations you can have. Think about not just what am I doing, how am I doing? What I think this gives us is actually opportunities to learn how to be proud in a healthy, holy way, to look at our lives and to craft them in ways that we feel proud of ourselves about. I'm really trying. God knows that I'm trying, and I'm going to keep on trying. I'm trying, and I'm going to keep on trying. All right. Have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Thank you.
Good Shabbos.
Thank
Thank
you.
That was very
So much.
inspiring.
The sources I'll put in the chat right now, and I'll leave them as a comment on the video. If you want to download the source sheet, just click it, and you can save in your browser, and you download it later. There's always more sources, you know that. All right, everybody. Here, copy that thing. I'm gonna end the meeting.
I know.